So how's everybody doing this morning? So I have lived this history for 60 of its 69 years. I'll make mention of this again at the end. Paula has put up with this since 1973, to which I'm very thankful. So, yeah, when they first asked me to speak, I said, what do you want me to speak on? They said, the history of the Tucson show. So this is one of these that I didn't have prepared already, so I had a lot of fun putting this together and reminiscing about all the people that I've met and befriended over the years. So, from humble beginnings, all oak trees start out from acorns. As we all know, Abraham Lincoln started his life in a log cabin in Kentucky, became one of our two greatest presidents. The same way with the Tucson show. What we see today is not what it was 69 years ago. So the Tucson show, actually, the spark for it occurred in Phoenix in the early part of 1955. At that time, and for the next 10 or so years, the largest gem and mineral show in Arizona was the Phoenix Gem and Mineral Show, put on by the Maricopa Lapidary Society and the Mineralogical Society of Arizona. By about 1958 or 1959, they had attendance numbers of close to 20,000 people. All right? But there were several members of the Tucson board and the Tucson Gem and Mineral Society that visited that show. And Bob Roots, who was a dealer in that show from Colorado, he talked to those folks and said, you know, you really ought to start a show in Tucson. So within the next 2 months, they had a show in place. It was held at the Helen Keeling Elementary School in the cafeteria. This is what the school looked like in 1955. The school is still there, but they have completely rebuilt it. A few of the original brick buildings are still in place. I would like to say, oops. That this plaque commemorates the start of the Tucson show, but it doesn't really. This is the group of people and the group of dealers that participated in that first show, and this is the show poster from that. As you can see, admission was free. They attracted 1,500 people to this show. And when everything was said and done, they showed a profit of $10, which they had to pay to the janitor for cleaning up. But the Tucson Gem and Mineral Society board would not commit any money to the show. This group of people had to go out, convince this list of dealers, and most of them are local: Claude Motel, Ann Rutledge, Ray Parent, Morris Elsing, and of course Richard Bedeau. They're all local here in Tucson. So, two of the teenage exhibitors that were there, Dick Bedeau and Gene Schlepp. Unfortunately, Dick Bedeau has passed a number of years ago, but Gene is still with us. They look a bit different, don't they? As you'll see, we all do. Two of the original organizers, Dan Caudill on the left, Clayton Gibson on the right, they both went on to serve as show chairs on numerous occasions. But by the next year, they decided to move into larger headquarters. This is the famous or infamous cattle barn at the Pima County Fairgrounds. One of the things that the show committee members had to do after the January rain is when they got access to the Quonset hut, they'd have to go in the back end and shovel all the cow manure out, because that's where the wholesale dealers were. But the January rains would wash it in, they'd shovel it out. Note that back then, the show was held in April. So at least for the next 10 years, it was held in April. So 1961, that's when the Tucson show really reset the bar. Clayton Gibson, gentleman on the right of this picture, invited Paul Desautels to come and exhibit at the show. The couple in the middle were the show chairman at the time, the Fordhams. And as you can see here, Paul came out to the show. In 1969, in that newspaper article, he described it as the best mineral show in the world. In later years, other shows would ask him, well, why did you go to the Tucson show? Because they asked me. In those early days, he would sleep on the couch in Bill and Millie Shoup's front living room in order to make ends meet and to make that happen. Now I know I'm pushing the right button. Okay? Other longtime members and show committee members, Cal Thompson on the left, Dick Flagg on the right. He was responsible for about 25 years of case maintenance and in our old cases. One of the things that Cal did for the show one year is it turned out his son-in-law was working for one of the US senators back in Washington, D.C. and had discovered this silver ink set. That silver ink set had been presented to Abraham Lincoln in 1863. It's made entirely of silver that was mined and refined in the then territory of Arizona. The reason 1863 is significant is because that's when he signed the proclamation that established the New Mexico and Arizona territories and defined the state boundaries as we know them today. 1965, some of the displays. The reason I wanted to show the one on the right, that's how we used to display thumbnails. I mean, that was a high-class thumbnail exhibit. And that also explains why thumbnail collections from the 50s and 60s don't fill a 1-inch cube. They had to fit. So that's 1 inch from there to there. So they had to fit inside that. Other long-time committee members, Bill and Millie Shoup helped run this show for a number of years, approaching decades. Terry Wallace served as show chairman for 5 years. 1970, this is where the mineralogical record got its start. A casual dinner conversation between John White, Art Montgomery, and Dick Bedeau at George Bedeau's, his father's home, one evening, precipitated what we now know as the mineralogical record. Again, from humble beginnings, but these things started at the Tucson show. 3 years later, there's Paul Desautels and John White on the right selling subscriptions at the show. Senor Folch Garona, very wealthy Spanish industrialist and mining engineer, built one of the world's finest and largest private mineral collections, was a long-time attendee at the show. I can remember seeing him in the mid-60s down at the Quonset Hut. Arthur Montgomery is the gentleman he's talking to on the right. Arthur Montgomery was the co-founder of the MR and a lot of the financial backing in those early years. One of the other things about Arthur Montgomery is he was the financial backing for Ed Over when Ed was out in the West collecting varicites and red cloud wolfenites and topazes up in Colorado and on and on. And of course, there's John White again. Looks a little bit different than in that first photo. The other thing that the Tucson show has spawned are satellite shows. As I tell people, when you go to any other show except for Tucson and Denver, the show, everything in that building is the show. There's nothing else. Starting in the mid-60s, because the space was limited in the Quonset Hut, mineral dealers that couldn't get into the show started setting up at the original Holiday Inn, which is between Congress and 22nd Street. It's no longer a Holiday Inn, but it's still a viable motel, and it still hosts a satellite show. But this is where the mineral dealers that couldn't get into the Tucson show would set up. And as I was told, you know, it was kind of like almost a clandestine thing that one of these dealers would walk up to you and say, hey, buddy, you want to come see my rocks? Okay? Wasn't quite that bad, but back then the show committee was adamantly opposed to any satellite dealers, any dealers setting up in a hotel, to the point where if they knew that you were set up in the Holiday Inn South, you would never get into the show as a dealer. All right? Times have changed. Again, mid-60s into the early 70s, the Desert Inn became the hub for mineral dealers. I was a student down here, and I can remember walking into the Desert Inn in 1971, a week before the show, and getting a first floor, first bank of rooms room. It was all of $20 a night. That's how I spent my afternoons doing my homework and selling minerals. The other thing that has grown up around Tucson are these street vendors. And for a while, it was a real issue because of the street safety and people, you know, wanting to pull off immediately and you know, see what rocks people had by the roadside. So the satellite shows have since grown over the years, and especially in the last 10 or so years, they've just exploded. There are now almost 50 satellite shows. Nowhere else in the world does this happen, and that's what makes Tucson the event that it is. So 1970, Paul Desautel had been in contact with his good friend Peter Embry at the British Museum of Natural History, and Mr. Embry brought an exhibit, the first time the British Museum had ever allowed any of their minerals outside of Great Britain for a display. So, in typical fashion, that's not the fashion at the time. Let's see, where is it? I think it's right there. The tradition at the time is if you showed up in a tie, it was going to get cut off. Okay? So, that's why that one's cut off like that, and I'm sure Paul's is the same way. But that's how they were greeted. 1972 is when the new Tucson Convention Center was built and the Tucson Gem Mineral Show moved into that new facility. Today, the original exhibit hall that held 26 dealers, and that was it for the next 17 years, that exhibit hall is now just used for storage and staging. All right? And of course, in 1990, they expanded into the facility that we see today, and that's where the Tucson show has been ever since. 1972 started something that no other shows had done. Maybe one other show. I think maybe the Detroit show had a special trophy. But John Patrick and Al McGinnis wanted to commemorate the memory of Ed McDowell. He was a longtime mineral collector, dealer, miner. In the early days, he would work as a tramp miner, which means that, you know, you work 6 months here, and then if the boss upsets you, you quit and you go someplace else. What he was chasing was as soon as he heard that there was a great pocket of minerals hit. That's when he would leave one mine and go to the other. So he worked at the Blackbird mine and found quite a pocket of Vivianites, among other things, and Butte, Montana, and all over. So he's really quite a character within the hobby, but he passed away in the early 70s. So John Patrick, Al McGinnis initiated the McDowell Trophy. And that was the featured trophy at the Tucson show until 1990, when Al McGinnis passed away. At that point, the show committee decided that the McDowell Trophy's time had passed, and we wanted to honor Paul Desautel with the same idea. I heard from a good friend of Ed McDowell's, and he was a little bit unhappy with me because he had heard all kinds of rumors about why we had changed that trophy. Okay? none of which were true. And I said the real reason was because right after Al McGinnis passed away, John Patrick sent us a letter that said if we ever gave the McDole Trophy again, he would sue us. Now, for those, I'm sure none of you know who John Patrick is. Al McGinnis was a nice guy. John Patrick prided himself on being a pain in the backside. When he was sober, he was even worse when he wasn't. But that's why we retired the McDole Trophy, because he sent a demand letter that said, you will not award the McDole Trophy. We said, okay. One of the other firsts, 1974, the first U.S. stamps that had pictures of minerals on them were issued at the Tucson Gem Mineral Show. The second set in 1992, the same way, and at that show, the post office actually set up a temporary post office and would stamp this kind of a commemorative postcard with those stamps on it, and they named it the Red Cloud Post Office. Oops. 1976, Tucson Gem and Mineral Society decided they were going to start publishing special papers. The very first one had been written by Dr. Mark Bandy, longtime mining engineer and mineral collector. He was a contemporary of Dr. Fred Poe at Harvard. And he had written this Mineralogy of Yayagua, Bolivia, where he worked for about 10 years, mainly for the mine staff. But his widow, Jean, lived in Wickenburg, and she was asked if TGMS could reprint that and sell it. She agreed wholeheartedly. There was only one hardbound book made. We bought it at the MR auction that Saturday because we were good friends with Gene. We never knew Mark because after they had moved to Wickenburg, he died from pancreatic cancer in the early 1960s. But Gene maintained the collection for another almost 20 years. I included so in this book, there's 3 or 4 color plates that weren't in the softbound version that was sold to the general public. This is a pair of oxide, probably the finest pair of oxide known. That spray is about, as I recall, 1.25 inches, maybe 1.5 inches across. The collection ultimately went to the LA County Museum of Natural History. That specimen never made it to the museum. No one knows where it was. But, so when I say color plates, I'm talking about extra pages, white pages, and those are color prints. And that's an accurate rendition of one of the 3 color prints in our book. So the technology and the quality has improved a bit since then. 1979, the 25th anniversary of the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show, the silver anniversary, TGMS put out this booklet commemorating the first 25 years of the show. That's a tombstone silver on the right, 4 silvers on the back cover, including this one that's still in our collection. It's actually from the Stonewall Jackson mine in McMillan. And that's the last specimen I bought from Walt Lidstrom, and I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. But Bob Jones wrote the text for all of that. I mentioned Walt Lidstrom earlier. Walt Lidstrom was a dealer that I met in 1965. I was on one side of the Quonset hut, Wayne Thompson was on the other, and he comes running across, he says, Les, he says, there's a dealer over here you have to meet. I said, well, why is that? And so bear in mind, I'm not quite 12 years old, Wayne's 14. Most dealers treated us like kids. We thought we should be treated like mineral collectors, all right? So Walt was 2 things to us. So Wayne says, Walt's the only dealer in this building that's talking to me like a mineral collector. You got to meet him. And then here's the punchline. He's willing to give us a 20% discount. So Walt's booth was the first one that I made every year. Back in 1972 through about 1990, when we were in the old X Hall, the dealers could actually drive their vehicles into the show and unload. Walt Lidstrom never had to unload his station wagon. There were 10 collectors that were standing right there, more than willing to be the first one to look through that stack of 4 or 5 flats as they put it on the table. Another longtime dealer, in this case, a wholesale dealer, was Benny Finn and his wife. Benny, among other things, was the man who collected all the great Botrytis mimetites from San Pedro Corralitos. All right? But dealers, no matter what people think, if we didn't have dealers, people really wouldn't come to any of these shows, because people want to come, they want to see the great exhibits, no question about that. But they also want to come to buy and see things that they would never see otherwise. So, you know, most times a show committee will make a business decision to expand their show based on attendance, more dealers. In the case of the Tucson show, going from the original X Hall of 26 dealers to the current hall that holds 175, it's a business decision, right? Well, 1981, the business decision was kind of driven by external forces. So TCC has a policy that they will not put a like event in one of the vacant buildings at the Tucson Convention Center 30 days prior and 30 days after. So that's why you've never seen one of the private show promoters with a show at the Tucson Convention Center the middle of January. They have tried, believe me, they have tried. But at this point, 26 dealers in the old X Hall. The arena was available, that's where they were playing hockey and various basketball and various other things. But the Tucson show didn't want to expand into that. Bigger area, more work, all right? Had a very successful business model. In January of 1981, the circus came to town. Middle of January, a distant cousin of this elephant died and was left in the arena at the Tucson Convention Center. All right? Fortunately, by the end of January, they got it out of there, but there was a lot of consternation because it was beginning to smell. Okay? So for 1982, that's why the Tucson Show Committee decided to do something with the arena rather than risking something like this happening again. And so in 1982 was the first time the show had dealers in the arena. They were mainly equipment demonstrators and that sort of thing. Ultimately, that part of the show was what we call general retail. Fossils, lapidary. In fact, any of the dealers in the arena could not have more than 20 or 25% minerals in their booth. They had to have other things. 1988, the very first Carnegie Mineralogical Award was presented to the Tucson Gem Mineral Society at the 1988 show. The award was for 1987. 1 year later, the first individual to win that was John Sinkankis. You've probably seen some of his books, but he was a retired Navy captain. He was faceting gemstones this big for the Smithsonian and other museums back when people were barely able to facet them that big. Truly, he was an author, he was a speaker, as close to a modern Renaissance man as I've ever met. He could do it all. And at the same time, you would never know it if you just met him, okay? Both he and his wife were very gracious. They were always willing to have people into their homes. We have a Japan Law quartz specimen from Washington Camp that we displayed either here or at Pasadena. A few months later, here comes this envelope from John Sinkankis, and he had done a pen and ink sketch of that and presented it. He was also an artist. Other show highlights, one of the long-standing events that TGMS offers is free rocks and minerals to kids. This is the famous egg box or egg carton. Diane certainly knows a great deal about that. So Ed McDowell was very, very camera shy. There's only one known picture of Ed McDowell. Pat McLean on the left, who is our executive manager and the glue that has been running this show for 30 or 35 years. She's also very camera shy. So I'm not sure if this picture was taken before the show, during the show, or after the show, but she could look like that anytime from about January 15th to February 15th. So I've talked about the Desautel's Trophy. It was initiated in 1991. The Lidstrom in 1978. After Walt passed away in 1977, his family provided money to the show committee for a special trophy. That trophy goes to the single best specimen contained within a competitive exhibit. So it's not like the judges walk around and find the best specimen anywhere in the show. It has to be in one of our competitive exhibits. The same way with the Desautel, you have to enter, even though it's ostensibly for the best case of rocks in the show, you have to specifically enter to be judged. Arthur Rowe was a longtime supporter of TGMS. When he passed away, the Art Rowe Micromount Symposium began at the Tucson show and continues to this day in his honor. So a few of the other things that really make the Tucson show a bit unique. Other shows are producing this kind of quality advertising. Tucson's been doing it for a long, long time. And I don't know of any other show where we have at least one national magazine that devotes its January, February issue to the show theme. Rocks and Minerals has been doing that for a long, long time. The one on the left was for 2012. The one on the right is the current show theme. Other things that Tucson has done or been recognized for, we've got over 40 years of posters. This is just one portion of one of the two walls that these posters are hung on in the TGMS clubhouse. And we've received several mayoral proclamations recognizing the importance and the value of the Tucson Gem Mineral Show. That proclamation is typed on a copper sheet. Pretty cool. I think we've received 2 or 3 of those from just the mayor's office. One of the other things that took place over a period of years when Betty Roberts was still alive, she decided to put together what she called a distinguished gathering. She started with a Lafarge pyromorphite. This was the second year with red cloud wolfenite. So this is 1980. This is 15 or 16 years before we hit our big pocket at the red cloud. It took at least a dozen collections to put that 24-inch wide case together. That's Garth Bricker's, that's Harvard's, that's probably the best single piece out of the Ed Over pocket that's in the Smithsonian, Tony Potacek, on and on and on. It took a lot of collections to bring this together. After our pocket, we could do this several times over. 2021, following the pandemic, this is what the Smithsonian crew sent out to us, acknowledging our contributions and their participation in the show. So I'm going to take you down memory lane for a bit. These are all photos from the 50th anniversary. Okay. Yes. My hair was brown as well. There's Marty Zinn, Bill and Robbie McCarty, Jim and Von Seal Bleese, the Sinkankases, Jeff Scoville, Ken and Betty Roberts. and a few more. Some of you might recognize that gentleman, Rock Courier, Jim and Mary Walker. Jim just passed away about a month and a half ago. Tony Potacek is still alive and doing well. Leonard Hines, he's just right around the corner here. I think he looks a little bit different. Gene Schlepp, Cal and Kareth Graber, and Peter, yes, that's not just shadowed. His hair was actually brown. One of the great things in my mind about the mineral collecting hobby is the people and the friends that you get to meet and make. Dr. Gene Myron, Dr. Steve Smale, Dr. Ed David. These are people that we would never meet in our normal lives. Gene Myron, one of Intel's top scientists. Steve Smale, one of the world's top mathematicians. Does anybody know why there isn't a Nobel Prize in mathematics? The story I got, because I asked that question one time, because I wondered why Steve Smale had never gotten the Nobel Prize for mathematics. Turns out that Alfred Nobel's wife was having an affair with a mathematician. So when he set up all the Nobel Prizes, he excluded mathematics. But Steve has been awarded, there's another medal that goes to the top mathematician and their work, and Steve has received that honor amongst others. Dr. Ed David, National Science Advisor to President Richard Nixon. But among other things, he was at the Bell Lab and on the team that developed the first transistor. I mean, these are pretty prominent individuals in their own fields. But when they walk onto that show floor, they're a mineral collector. And that's what makes this hobby so great. Keith Proctor, from humble beginnings as a vacuum cleaner salesman, and built one of the finest private collections. So one thing about Keith, I still remember any number of times he would be standing by his case and solicit compliments from people walking by, all right? I always thought the minerals spoke for themselves, but he liked to hear that from people. 2001, Russia was our theme. Bob Jones was the show chairman, and he was able to get the Tsarina's Easter egg, which was part of the Malcolm Forbes egg collection. Malcolm Forbes at that time had the largest Fabergé egg collection outside of Russia. Maybe it was even larger than Russia's, but that required the curator got one first-class seat, the egg got another first-class seat. All right, that was part of the requirements for us to bring that to the show. At the same time, Bob started talking to people. There were a number of Fabergé items in collections here in Tucson and Southern California, not eggs, but other Fabergé jewelry items. And so we had several cases with these art objects in. Tatiana Fabergé, Peter Fabergé's great-granddaughter, great-granddaughter, and the Russian ambassador helped open that show. 2004, our 50th anniversary. All right, among other things, Harvard brought their famous ram's horn gold, and this time the Mineralogical Record published the history. A lot more color photography, but Bob Jones wrote all the text. Brian Swoboda initiated What's Hot in Tucson, and he's become an institution around here for the past couple of decades. 2005 is when this group at the top initiated what became the American Mineral Treasures book. And the reason why I wanted to show both of these pictures is to show in 2005, they started the process. 3 years later, when the book came into fruition, they were still smiling and they were still friends. and still alive. And I think, with the exception of that gentleman, everybody else is still with us. So Gene Myron, of course, Wendell Wilson, Bob Jones, Brian Lees, Carl Francis, and Jeff Scoville. 2008, that's when the book came out. All right, it was premiered at the Tucson show. We had cases devoted to each one of the localities in that book. It required people like myself, especially Brian Lees, who drove his truck down full of just the minerals coming from Colorado and other places for a number of these exhibits. 2012, the Arizona Centennial, among other things, we premiered our book on collecting Arizona. Same way, we put together 50 cases of Arizona minerals as part of that show. Quite an undertaking. I don't plan on doing that again. But never say never, right? A couple of years later, our show theme was wolfenite. 1 year after this, the Arizona State Legislature passed the bill that made wolfenite the official state mineral for Arizona. So future show themes next year will be Shades of Green. 2026, in honor of the 250th birthday of the United States, the theme will be red, white, and blue minerals. I want to thank Bob Jones especially for putting these two histories together, and a lot of the photographs that you've seen here, the MR, of course. I already mentioned my wife, Paula. She's been putting up with this since 1973. I've been doing it since 1964. And of course, all the TGMS volunteers, and especially Pat McLean and Rose Marquez, who make this show happen. The friends, fellow collectors, dealers, and curators that I have met and made over the past 60 years. I certainly won't see this show in 50 years, but there are others that had better pick up the gauntlet and keep it going. And I want to thank Bob Jones again for being my friend and mentor for 60 years. Thank you very much. If I'd done a full history, we'd be here for another 2 hours. Okay. Any questions? Yes?
So that copper sheet from the mayor, those are really special. Where are those located?
They're in the clubhouse towards the north end on the east wall, kind of above the bookcases, kind of in the shadows. There's half a dozen or 8 of those sorts of things from the Chamber of Commerce and the mayor's office and whatnot, but they're out on display.
Because I had mentioned those letters to people at the museum, you know, passengers to do that. It'd be nice to have one and borrow one from display.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so talk to Pat, talk to Elizabeth Gass,
Yes.
you know, and I was just down there and mentioned that the Arizona Hall starts to need, in my opinion, some changes, okay? Because they've changed the gem vault half a dozen times in the past 3 years, and certainly things in the Mineral Evolution Hall. Believe me, the Arizona Hall is fabulous, but there's a lot of the exhibits that have been there since the museum opened. So, yes?
Hi, Les. How are you?
I am fine.
Good. I just was curious, and after all the years of coming to this show, is there one memory or one story that you find yourself recounting, like dozens of times throughout the years?
You know, the elephant is a fun one. No, every year. So I've been on the show committee for 36 or 37 years, and every year we put on this fabulous show, and we don't think we can do better. Okay, but because of all the exhibitors that are willing to bring their specimens to the show, the dealers that are participating and supporting our show, somehow we seem to at least maintain that high level of quality. And there are years like 2008 with the American Mineral Treasures, 2012 the Arizona Centennial. you know, the stories you remember are the ones that the ones that stick out in your mind are the ones that are usually more disastrous than pleasant. For example, the dragon gold, okay? Imagine Brian's horror and our horror when we came in one morning and discovered that the back panel had fallen over and bent the top 1.5 inches of that. Obviously, nobody else knew that. But Brian took it back to his motel room. They worked on it for, you know, about a half an hour and bent it back up. And you know, the scary part is you bend it up and it breaks, right? That did not happen. So, you know, the ship of gold was great. I remember one year, because I've been in charge of competitive exhibits for that period of time, and I'm walking towards the best of theme case, and all of a sudden, a collector that had put in a red cloud wolfenite crystal, it was missing. Another collector had taken it and moved it into the next case. He thought it was funny. There were several of us that weren't quite so amused, okay? No, it's a show unlike any others, and every year is great, and it's great to see those of us who are left, because one of the things that was very nostalgic as I was going through a lot of the photographs in the 50th anniversary was, you know, how many of these people have been friends for however many decades, and those that we have lost because of age and illness and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I could go almost year by year and say, yeah, you know, there was something there. I'd need the 50th anniversary book to remind me, but, you know, watching places like this, Mineral City, grow up, you know, from just hotels, and the Desert Inn getting torn down, and then Marty had to find a new place, and that was the Executive Inn, and then he moved up or into the Tucson Inn Suites or whatever they called it for so many years. So lots and lots and lots of fond memories.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Well, just a comment really. I mean, I think for me, the American Mineral Treasures exhibits were the finest that I think the show's ever put on, certainly in the times that I've been there. And I think it's almost impossible that can ever be topped, considering the amount of effort that went into that over several years.
Yeah, it was the three-year process.
And I think following on from that is what are your views on how the show is developing now and the medium to long term for the TGMS show?
Well, I've given a great deal of thought to that over the years, along with others who have been involved with the show. I think the future of the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show is good, but obviously it's changing and has changed. All the best mineral dealers that used to display at the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show are now at Mineral City or in this building. The dynamics and the economics have changed. All right, no question that when you can start selling specimens for $500,000 and $1 million, you can afford these kinds of venues. But in terms of what makes the Tucson show unique is the fact that for 4 days we become a temporary worldwide museum. There's no other show that does that, with the exception of Munich and Denver to a lesser degree. And that's what will always make Tucson special in the grand scheme of things. Because most of the paid attendees at the Tucson show are local residents, you know, Tucson, Phoenix, whatnot, and that's what supports the society in the show. But a lot of those high-end mineral dealers that have moved into other venues continue to support our show. They understand the legacy of the show and why it's important that the show needs to be and that it needs to continue. So I think the prospects are very good, with this one caveat. Just like everywhere else in the hobby and the business, we need young blood. I mean, I turned 72 in April, and while I hope to be around for another 20 or 25 years, I'm not going to be on the show committee for another 20 or 25 years. We sure as heck aren't going to be dealers in the show, you know, for that period of time. And that's why you see a lot of the younger dealers that are coming into our show, but we need that help on the show committee as well. And I mean, Pat McLean and Rose are going to retire someday. We're going to need somebody younger to take on those jobs and that legacy. That's really where the help is going to come from, and I'm already working, at least in my little part of the world, on a much younger replacement. So thank you for those comments. All right, let's go eat lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.